Hello and welcome to Transfermarkt. My name is Matt and I'm joined by Stefan to discuss the business done by Tottenham Hotspur this window. We're going to take a look at the outgoings as Ange Postecoglou managed to get a number of players off his wage bill, but also the incomings, which some have said may leave him short in the coming season. But Stefan, I want to start with those outgoings because it's been quite a busy summer for Tottenham and it's kind of followed on from January. In January we saw players like Ivan Perisic and Eric Dyer go out on loan, and those deals have been made permanent this summer. But added to that list in the last couple of months has been, among others, Oliver Skipp, Emerson Royal, Joe Rodon, Giovanni Lo Celso, Tanguy Ndombele, who's of course released, Ryan Sessegnon, Pierre-Emile Højbjerg, and we'll show the full list on screen for everyone to continue reading. But the main question is, how impressed have you been with how ruthless Tottenham have been and how effective they've been in being able to get these players off their books?
Yeah, I think ruthless is probably the best word to describe it. This seems very much like Ange Postecoglou continuing to kind of gut that squad that he inherited. I think last time we spoke with Tottenham on this show, actually, we discussed about the way that the average age of this team has just begun to continuously dropping since Postecoglou come in. Obviously, Antonio Conte before him and Mourinho probably as well, two of his predecessors who favoured older, more senior players, ready-made stars who could kind of take them to the top four or challenging for silverware. And Postecoglou's came in with a completely different purview. I think he's come in to obviously develop players, develop a team, maybe go back to what was once the case as a squad of young, exciting players that could maybe achieve something. And that often means that you have to sell these older players. You have to get rid of them one way or another. As you said, we've seen guys like Perisic moving on for free, Ndombele, who, record signing, moving on for free, Eric Dyer moving on for free, but also other ones like, Højbjerg, Brian Gill, Solomon. I know Solomon's just a straight loan deal, but, these are all probably deals that with at least an obligation to buy or an expectation that these players will be moved on permanently. But I think there's also quite a lot of good business being done, to be honest with you. I think 23.5 million euros for Oliver Skipp is a lot good money for Tottenham. Emerson Royal for 15 million, Joe Rodon, it all adds up to about 55 million euros in income. And, as we know in the Premier League these days with the financial fair play rulings, and quite specifically a lot of the clubs that Tottenham are really going toe-to-toe with, i.e. Newcastle and Aston Villa, having to really bend over backwards in the transfer window this summer to make sure they don't trip over any kind of rules and regulations. I think Tottenham have done a really good job of gutting that team and the players that Postecoglou doesn't want, but also bringing in a decent amount of money for some pretty average squad players. But what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think a lot of Tottenham fans have likened it to the beginning of the time under Mauricio Pochettino, where both managers have effectively come into what is a mix and match squad from so many different managers, because since Pochettino was sacked in 2019, Postecoglou was the fourth permanent manager that they've had, and there was a portion of that squad that was built by Jose Mourinho, a portion built by Nuno Espirito Santo, a portion built by Antonio Conte, and it just wasn't a squad that particularly gelled together very well and were suited to a similar style of play. So I think while of course players need to be brought in, and I think depth needs to be added to the squad in a lot of areas, getting rid of the players that just don't suit the side is really, really important. And Eric Dyer is a prime example. He was part of the leadership team before Conte came in. He was favoured by every manager since Pochettino. Even though Tottenham fans often had their qualms with him, he was a player that managers quite liked. But Postecoglou simply took the view that he's not a centre-back who can play in a high line. He has to go. Ivan Perisic maybe doesn't have the legs anymore to play in the physically demanding left-back role. So he's been really ruthless, and it's just simply trying to build that squad that is suited to what he needs to do. And I think that brings us on nicely to the incomings as well, because he's bringing in young players that he's going to be able to mould into
Matt, Before you move on, actually, before you do that, because this question just popped in my head, and as you watch Tottenham quite a lot, is there anyone on that list that you would have not sold? Because I have a kind of soft spot for Højbjerg, for example, but I appreciate that maybe he's a senior player who was having to step aside for younger players, and Bissouma, obviously the most obvious one. But he might have been a player that might have been handy to keep in the squad either way. But, I mean, that's just my opinion. But is there anyone on that list there that you think, we should have maybe not sold him?
I think Højbjerg probably is the one that stands out the most, because even last season, and Højbjerg is more of an enforcer in the middle of the park. He can break up play, and he's not the best in the world at that position, but he's a player who's definitely been a big asset to Tottenham in doing that recently. But where now Postecoglou needs players who can get on the ball, who can dribble forward, who can progress with passes, with dribbling, and needs to be a lot more expansive than what Højbjerg offers. I think that's probably the reason why he did go, but it also needs to be mentioned that especially coming off the bench last season, Højbjerg was extremely effective for Spurs, and there was games where he came on, whether Spurs were chasing a game or if they were trying to hold a lead that they had. He was a really good option for the bench, bringing experience. He always wears his heart on his sleeve. He plays for the badge in every way that he possibly can. But I would say another factor in that is that he was in the last year of his contract, and it's a strange deal because it's a loan transfer initially with an obligation to buy in 12 months, which is when the contract comes to an end. But I'm sure it was just financial reasons that kind of moved that one around a little bit. The other one that I would look at, and I know a lot of Spurs fans would probably disagree with this, but it is Emerson Royal. He's a very, very versatile player. I think he doesn't suit the typical fullback that Postecoglou needs, with inverting high up the pitch and needing to be good on the ball, good operating in tight spaces. But in the last couple of seasons for Tottenham, he's played right back, he's played centre back, he's played left back. And while he's not overly full of quality, I think he's a better option than some young players that Tottenham may have to look to bring in this season, because if Destiny Udogie picks up an injury at left back, maybe you can bring in Jed Spence, but you have to remember 12 months ago, he wasn't in the plans at all. He wasn't in the project. Or you may have to look towards a younger player in the academy because they haven't added depth in that left back role. So I think, especially looking at how much Postecoglou does like versatility, it was a surprise to me maybe that Emerson was top of that list of players that they wanted to get out the door. But I don't think there's anyone that Tottenham would rue having let go in 6, 12 or 18 months' time. But yeah, looking at those incomings, as we were saying, I want to get your opinion on the business, because I feel a lot of Tottenham fans think that the club have been left short this window, and while depth has been added in certain areas of the pitch, the first team quality outside of Dominic Solanke and the signing of a new striker pretty much remains the same. What do you think about the signings they've made?
Yeah, well, they've obviously spent a lot of money. They spent, just under 150 million euros, and I would more or less say it's a lot of smart signings. It kind of comes across as someone who's started a new Saving Football Manager or something, where they've got their short list of handy wonder kids that, they're like, well, these guys are going to be great in 5 years' time, so I'm going to sign them now and hopefully they'll turn out well for me. Archie Gray is the most obvious example of that, who I think we did a video as the most expensive 18-year-old ever, maybe, or one of them, at least in England, that's for sure. And then obviously Wilson Odobert is another exciting young player, and then you've got the other guys from outside the UK in Bergvall and Yang from South Korea. I mean, on the one hand, I think these are all just very kind of smart signings that clubs like Spurs should be making, in the sense that they can't really go around signing ready-made stars every summer. They do have to kind of be smart about that. If you actually look at the clubs above them, for example, Manchester City, Liverpool, and unfortunately Arsenal, more often than not, maybe Arsenal not so much, but definitely Liverpool and Manchester City are almost kind of cutting out the middlemen in European football in terms of, signing, waiting for clubs like, say, Gladbach or Dortmund to develop these players into wonder kids. Manchester City in particular just going out signing them already. They're going straight to Brazil, they're going straight to Belgium, they're going straight to Spain or France, whatever, sticking them in the youth academies and then loaning them out. And I think that's something that a lot of Premier League clubs are having to do more and more of, because they realise that the margins, when you let a club in France or Germany develop these players, means that they have to pay an extra 40, 50 million euros in 3 or 4 times for a player that they could have signed for 10, 15, 20 million euros. And I look along that list and I think that's exactly what we're talking about there. An Archie Gray is probably a player that you could very easily see move to like a Bournemouth or a Fulham or a Brentford, and then Tottenham would have been forced to spend twice what they've paid to summer for him if they wanted to go out and sign him, say in a couple of years' time. So I think there's a lot of smart signing. I think also Postecoglou, the kind of head coach that he is, just prefers working with young players. I think he prefers working with players that are willing to listen to his ideas. They're willing to be very open-minded about tactics. When he says we're going to try something different, they're open-minded to that. And I think that also maybe is mirrored in the players that are sold on, with the likes of maybe Emerson Royal or Højbjerg. These are probably players who are quite experienced, know what kind of football they can play, what they can't play. And maybe, without really suggesting anything untoward, maybe Postecoglou just simply thought, well, I want more players in the squad who are a bit more passionate about what kind of football and what tactics I want to play. And typically young players are far more open-minded about that stuff. So you might find that Postecoglou just simply enjoys having younger players to work with. And that's obvious from the fact that, even with Solanke in there at 26 years old, I think the average age of the new signings was 22.5. And as I mentioned, we did an article and a video not so long ago on how the average age of that Tottenham team has really fell quite dramatically since Postecoglou came in. The only one that really stood out to me at the time as me thinking that might be a bit of a panic signing was Solanke. I do like him. I think he's a great striker. I think he's, proven as a Premier League player. It was just the price, really. 65 million euros is a lot of money to pay for a player who maybe doesn't really move the needle that much for Tottenham in terms of he doesn't exactly add anything new to that Tottenham squad. He's just maybe a more dependable version of Richarlison, or maybe a slightly better player than Richarlison. But maybe this is just me showing him my age, but I think 65 million euros is probably a fee that should mean a little bit more than just your kind of standard Premier League player. And I do completely appreciate that Solanke's still relatively young for a striker. He's still probably got 2 or 3 years before he really hits his peak. And at a Tottenham team that probably create a lot more chances in his previous club, then he might be well suited there. But at the same time, I think Bournemouth were really, really well set up to get the best out of him last season. They're a very direct team, and he got on the ball a lot. It'd just be interesting to see how Solanke fits into that squad. But from the very little we've seen of him so far in a Tottenham top, he seems to have done well before that injury. But yeah, what did you make of that sign? Do you think it kind of covered all bases? And do you think these young players, do you think any of them are really ready to step into that first team this season?
I think the young players are maybe not ready to get into that starting 11, but I think we've seen, even from their inclusion already with Archie Gray and Lucas Bergvall, that I think Ange trusts them, which is a huge thing for two 18-year-olds walking in. And maybe it's less surprising with Archie Gray, who has been in a Premier League side before, and I'm not sure how much he played with Leeds. He was only 15 years of age when he was there, but I know he was in and around that first team. But for Bergvall coming in from Sweden, a league that I think isn't really seen as a very high quality league, especially from fans of English football. But the biggest compliment I think Ange could have given them is in that game against Leicester, not long after Jamie Vardy equalised, when the crowd were getting on top of Spurs and they were struggling to get a hold of the game. Postecoglou threw Gray and Bergvall into that game together, two 18-year-olds to try and regain control. And they did manage to do it to some extent, not in a way to go on and win the game, but I think the trust there that Ange showed is absolutely fantastic. And I watched a lot of Bergvall in Sweden last season, from when Tottenham agreed that deal up until the end of his time there, and he's a class above everyone he came up against in that league. Whether it was players his age or very experienced players in that competition, the question was always going to be whether or not he could translate that to the Premier League. I suppose how quickly he could translate that to the Premier League, and he does already look very comfortable. He doesn't look out of place. He's happy to get on the ball. He's happy to take risks in possession, which again is something we know Postecoglou loves. And an aspect of signing young players, which I think needs to be mentioned as well, is Ange has spoken so often, not just at Tottenham, but in his time at previous clubs, that he wants to sign players who want to play for the club. He doesn't want to bring in players that want European football, and Tottenham are in the Europa League, so they join Spurs for that. Because we might not always be in the European football, he wants players who wants to play for Tottenham, just like he wanted players that wanted to play for Celtic. And I think players like Archie Gray and Lucas Bergvall and Yang Min-hyuk, who'll be coming in January, definitely fit that bill. And I think Yang is a fantastic player as well. I just would always give the warning that he's definitely not at the level of Gray and Bergvall. Even though he's the same age, I think he still has a lot more development to go until he can consider himself a challenger for a place in the Tottenham first team. On Dominic Solanke, I definitely agree with you on the fee. I think 64.3 million euro is a lot of money for a player who's only really had one successful season in the Premier League. And I know, of course, it was last season, scoring 19 goals for that Bournemouth side. I just think there's certain attributes in there that the Tottenham have maybe overpaid for. Of course, the English tax, which everyone likes to talk about. He's someone with Premier League experience, and when you're looking at the strikers who scored the most goals in the Premier League last season, Spurs were never going to be able to get Ollie Watkins. Of course, Erling Haaland, Mo Salah, those players are always off the cards. Ivan Toney, I'm not sure he's someone who fit Tottenham from an off the pitch perspective. I think maybe Solanke was the best option in that group, so maybe they were willing to overpay for that reason. But like you said, from what we've seen from him so far, it's just been that game against Leicester. But he got into so many fantastic positions. He had a lot of opportunities. Granted, he didn't take any of them, but it's a massive step forward from where Spurs were with Richarlison last season, when he always just seemed to be in the wrong place. And there's one moment in particular, which I always remember at the start of last season. I can't remember exactly who Spurs were playing, but there was a cross came into the box. It deflected onto the post, and Richarlison was standing at the edge of the 6-yard box. And as it deflected off the post, he gambled and went left, and the ball went right. And it's a 50-50 choice. He would have had an easy tap in if it got to him. But that just kind of, for me, sums up Richarlison's career at Tottenham so far, that he's just always one step away, always kind of one decision away, where I think Solanke just has that knack a little bit more, which I think will benefit Spurs this season when you have the players they have putting the ball into the box. I think Solanke could be a success. He's not going to score 30 goals a season, But if they have someone who can score 15 to 20 every year, I think that's the perfect addition to what is already a side that has a lot of diversity in their goal scorers. So
Can I
yeah,
ask
I
a quick
think.
question about
Yep.
Bergvall, actually? Just in terms of, I mean, I completely agree with you about Solanke and the rest of them. I'm just intrigued. Do you think Bergvall's kind of been brought in as this kind of, and I know he was signed technically last season, but do you think he's been brought in as this kind of understudy to James Maddison? Because we saw last season where Maddison was really kind of almost overplayed or over-relied on, and then as soon as his kind of goals and assists dried up in that number 10 position, Tottenham kind of really struggled in the second half of the season. And if you also kind of look at that team and that forward line, yes, there are players that can play number 10. Of course, you can stick Son there if you have to, or Johnson, or even Kulusevski maybe. But is Bergvall the only kind of ready-made, maybe not ready-made, but actual number 10 who can play if Maddison has to step out of the squad this season?
I think Tottenham's plans here have changed quite a bit over the summer, for a number of different reasons. I think that they found in pre-season that Kulusevski maybe is better suited to a central position than he is out wide. Of course, there'll be certain games where he'd serve better on the right hand side. We've also heard a lot of reports over the summer that Tottenham had planned to bring in another number 6 or another number 8, but given how impressive Bergvall and Gray were in pre-season, that they opted to steer away from that and to rely on the two of them. So I think Bergvall in particular, he for Jordan last season in Sweden, he most of the time played as a number 8 on the left hand side or the right hand side in midfield, and he was good at both aspects of that. He was good defensively, he was good dropping deep, pick up the ball. He was also good putting the strings a little bit further forward. So from what I watched of him, he didn't often play as a number 10, but he definitely has the attributes to do that. And in pre-season, I think what was most impressive from him is his pressing, and not just the effort that he puts in, but how effective he is in doing it. Tottenham scored a goal against Bayern Munich, which he laid on a plate for his compatriot Dejan Kulusevski, from his incessant pressing and managing to win that ball high up the pitch. And it was one example of quite a few of them. So I think he does have that creativity. It's definitely a fantastic option to have there for Tottenham. I would see him maybe more as a number 8 and someone who could deputise to Pap Sarr, mainly because Kulusevski hasn't kind of put himself in there as the second number 10. But the versatility that he has in those positions is absolutely incredible. And I really do think Tottenham have a better player in their hands than even they had expected 6 months ago, which can only be a good thing for only €10 million. In my eyes, it's been a fantastic buy. I just want to ask you, Stefan, before we do wrap up, I want to get a rating out of 10 for you from you on Tottenham's business this summer, both incomings and outgoings, and maybe with a look towards what they didn't do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably go quite high for them. I mean, the only kind of criticism I could say is maybe the kind of price they paid for Solanke, but as you really perfectly pointed out, unless you were to go abroad and bring in a player from another league, which we've seen Tottenham do in the past, and it hasn't really worked out. They've kind of had like kind of long category of players before Kane and somewhat afterwards that it's a struggle to sign that number 9. So maybe they paid a little bit too much for Solanke. But besides that, I'm really struggling for, where they made anything wrong. Maybe they could have brought in another central defender. As we talked about, maybe there's a situation where they could have held on to Højbjerg. Even, I still think Eric Dyer would have done a decent job, to be honest with you, since he is kind of still a decent backup for Bayern Munich at this moment in time. But I think on the whole, there's a lot of exciting players they brought in. They've moved on a lot of players that want to be there. And I would go so far as to say, actually, Tottenham have done a really good job of putting together a squad that should do what Postecoglou wants them to do, and they should be good enough to get him to where he should take them. So much so that I'd actually say, without trying to put like a kind of negative spin on it, I think it actually puts a bit more pressure on Postecoglou this season to really show what he's capable of as a head coach, because I think man for man, it is a really well put together squad. And if we don't see that translate into results and translate into Postecoglou building a system and tactics to get them pushing for top 4 or at least competing with the likes of Villa and Tottenham, Tottenham and Villa and Newcastle, then I think question marks should be asked of Postecoglou rather than the squad at his hands. So I'll go for like a good 8 out of 10, I think, and say for the most part they did a really good job this summer. But what did you think?
I think I'd probably go a little bit lower than you, and I'd aim for maybe a 6.5 or a 7 out of 10. I think just to mention as well, the signing of Wilson Odobert, I think was a clever one from Tottenham. Again, maybe you can question the fee, but last season Tottenham really lacked a 1v1 specialist and a player who could just get on the ball, get his head down and try and create something. And Timo Werner to some extent did alleviate those concerns, but the end product just wasn't always there. And I think Odobert, again, at 19 years of age, he's come in and he started both games for Tottenham so far, which I think shows just how much he's in those plans. So I do think that was a really good signing. But my concerns for Spurs are in the business that they didn't do. This season there's only 3 centre backs there that you can see as really good first team options in Romero, Van de Ven and Dragusin. And when you look at the injuries Tottenham had in the back line last season, maybe a little bit more depth there would have done quite well for them. You also have to look, like I mentioned, at left back with no reliable backup to Destiny Udogie. Power on the other side, now that Spence is back in the mix, maybe you can tick that box as one that's fine. But again, the fact that Spence wasn't included in the Europa League squad, again, it just raises questions about where he actually is in the plans for Postecoglou. So my biggest concern for Tottenham is that back line. And last season, Tottenham played 41 matches throughout the entire season. This season, they're guaranteed to play a minimum of 48. That squad needed to be bigger. It's now smaller. I think there's more quality in there. But in terms of depth, that for me just hasn't been addressed as much as it needed to be. So I'll go for a 7. I'll round it up from 6.5 and say a 7 out of 10. But I do agree with you as well that the Postecoglou, now that he has more of that squad that he needs put together, the expectations are higher. And I think top 4 and at the bare minimum challenging for a trophy, and I mean semi-final, final of a trophy, is what Tottenham need this season, or questions will start to be asked. Let us know in the comments down below your rating out of 10 for Tottenham's business this summer. Do you think it's enough to put them into that top 4 and back into Champions League football where they were for the decade or so before Postecoglou came in? Hit the subscribe button as well if you want more of these chats throughout the season, and of course hit the like button if you've enjoyed this one. But for now, and as always, thanks for watching.